So I'm back again, and this time I'm going to tell you the story of driverless cars. It's one of these, I mentioned earlier that one of the first robots that most of you will interact with on a personal basis is going to be your car. And, but the story of cars is really interesting because when we think about exponential technologies, it might be the case that the car is not the best example. The cars have not changed for almost 100 years. In fact, cars have become a symbol of status. They've become a symbol of freedom in many ways. But even from the earliest days of cars, people are already beginning to think about how they might automate and have driverless cars. This is a 1939 Futurama World Fair in New York, almost 100 years ago. And it was, this was the GM pavilion. GM was sort of the Google of 1939, this innovative company that does amazing things. And the World Fair had a lot of exhibits showing people what the world of the future is going to look like, very much like this meeting today. And there were lots of exhibits, but there was one exhibit in particular, the GM Pavilion, that had lines of people all around. And GM showed the world what the next century is going to look like. And what they had is amazing, it's an amazing sort of a mock city that was built over a very large area. And they had people, you would get a chair, and you would ride this chair around and look down. I'm sure that today would be illegal, but back then you would sit there and look down, and you could see what the city of the future looked like. You would see skyscrapers and industries and agriculture. You would see everything. You would see highways. But the thing that fascinated everybody the most were the driverless cars. 1939, almost 100 years ago, people were looking down. Cars were barely invented. People were already imagining a city with all the cars are going to drive by themselves. So, of course, that vision had to wait. A lot of things happened after 1939, World War II, and other things had to wait. But after the war was over, quickly people went back to start thinking about driverless cars again. This is 1956, where GM has this commercial on TV that shows what driverless cars are going to look like. And the idea was to use this new technology called transistors to detect a buried wire in the ground that would allow a car to sense if it's on the road or if it's not on the road. Basically, a car, there's a wire and there's a magnets and it can sense. So they had this commercial where the car drives onto the road and you can see the buried wire. This is, of course, all Hollywood. It didn't exist. And they immediately start bursting into song and drinking whiskey and smoking, and everything sounds good in this driverless car. But again, it turned out that it was very difficult to make. So soon after 1959, already people are beginning to build these machines in reality. This is RCA, actually bury the wire, and you have a car here even without a steering wheel, and it's driving around and it's actually guiding itself. So it seems like the technology was already there. Here's more or less at the same time, early 1960, UK transportation system is building this Ford Cortina. You can see the two sensors in the front, and here it is driving itself. And when I saw this for the first time, I thought, wow, there's no steering wheel. But then I realized it's a UK vehicle, and the steering wheel is actually on the other side. But the steering wheel, but still it's driving itself. And it drives in the snow, and it's really fantastic. So it seemed like the technology was already there. So what did we have to wait? Why do we have to wait until 2018 to start seeing these driverless cars in reality? Well, a couple of things happened. One of them, safety, suddenly became an issue. 1960s, 70s, suddenly people are thinking about safety, not just about performance. Cars, fuel safety, seat belts, all these other things, and also fuel economy. So fuel economy suddenly becomes an issue, miles per gallon, kilometers per liter, all these different numbers begin to play out. And as Lee Iacocca writes in his memoirs, the CEO of Chrysler at the time, it stopped being fun to build cars. Suddenly you have to worry about efficiency and safety, but also something else happened. And that is that it turned out that putting wires in the road was too expensive. There was an infrastructure cost, which is the sort of the dollar per mile to build, to bury, to maintain, to operate these cables was too high. And so the one lesson we learned from the early driverless cars is you can have all the technology that you want, but when it comes to investment, infrastructure is a bad thing. Any investment that you need to invest in the infrastructure, it does not scale. Now, just as cars were already becoming pretty fancy in the 60s and even in the 50s, another technology started. Technology that seemed like it was not going to go anywhere. And that is robotics. In 1950, robotics looked more or less like this. Really not very exciting, but autonomous robots nonetheless. But as I showed you earlier, robotics rides a very different curve. Whereas automotive industry is sort of almost stationary for the past 100 years, robotic technologies follows Moore's law and other exponentials and keeps on moving forward. And so what seemed like almost an impossible approach to autonomous vehicles suddenly became more and more feasible. So to understand driverless cars, you have to realize that really the body of a driverless car is the same as a conventional car, electric or gasoline. What is different about driverless cars is, of course, the brain, the mind, the AI that is driving it. And when we look at the control of an autonomous vehicle, there's really three levels of control. The lower level of control is the machinery that keeps the car going in a straight line and makes it turn, and that we solved decades ago. There's the high-level AI that decides where to go, what's the shortest path from A to B, with traffic, without traffic. We solved that decades ago. But the thing that always kept driverless cars back is what we call the mid-level control, this 1 minute horizon of deciding how to integrate into traffic or to avoid an obstacle. That 1 minute horizon has been the thing that really stopped driverless cars from actually happening. And I'll give you one example. This is a 2007 DARPA Grand Challenge called the Urban Challenge, which was about making driverless cars drive around a mock city. And what you're seeing here is a collision between, maybe the first ever collision between two driverless cars. It was between the MIT vehicle and the Cornell vehicle, and I was at Cornell at the time. And by the way, I want to emphasize it was the MIT vehicle that collided into the Cornell vehicle. So when that happened, everybody rushed over to see what had happened, because unlike human drivers that collide, when driverless cars collide, they keep very, very meticulous records of what they saw, what happened, how did they reach their decision. Everything is on the record. There's no guessing. So we looked inside, and it turns out that something very interesting happens. Both cars could sense the other cars. The sensors worked, there was no blinding sun, there was no fog. But what happened is that both cars thought the other car was a concrete block. And then it continued moving. In other words, cars could sense, but they could not understand what they were seeing. And that again has been the Achilles heel of driverless cars, is that machines could see, but they couldn't understand. And I showed you earlier how this new kind of AI finally solved this problem, allowing cars to understand what they're seeing, not just dogs and cats and chairs, but really other cars and so on. So when you think about why driverless cars are suddenly taking off today, it's not a coincidence. After all, we could control cars with computers. We've had software inside cars for decades. So what has changed in the last 5 years? Just one thing, that finally the AI in the car can understand the difference between a pothole and a puddle, or between a toddler and a fire hydrant. Up until 6 years ago, no AI could tell the difference between these two things. You could see them on radar, the AI would know to avoid them, but we drive very differently, next to a fire hydrant on the side of the road than we do next to a toddler on the side of the road. But AI up until 6 years ago could not tell the difference. But now it can. And it can do that very easily, again, not because some clever software developer wrote some special software to understand the difference between different cars or different objects. No, it is only data-driven. There's somebody who labeled these different kinds of cars, and the machine learned on its own how to distinguish between these things. And that is allowing driverless cars to suddenly learn how to drive. So it's all about accumulating this experience of driving. And when you look at different companies in the driverless car business and try to think about how they're moving forward and what differentiates them, increasingly what differentiates them is one thing. How much data do they have driving? This is the difference between the Teslas and the Waymos and the Baidu's, all these different car companies. It's all about how much data they get. And I was driving in a Tesla in China just a few months ago, and the driver told me that he gets charges for free in return for data. So quite literally, data is the fuel that is fueling the machine. So it's a big race on who has the more data. And it's something that I think we need to understand, that these cars right now are like teenagers learning how to drive. And the more they drive, the faster they will learn. And it also means that if you want your cars to learn how to drive in Rome, for example, you can't take a car from Palo Alto and put them in Rome. You have to let them learn in Rome how to drive. If you want them to learn to drive in Manhattan, you have to let them practice in Manhattan. And that's one of the challenges. People always ask, when will I have cars in my city? It's when your city decides to allow these cars to train there. Because they are like human, they need to accumulate that experience. And I mentioned earlier the cloud effect, that once a few cars learn how to drive, they can teach that to other cars, and you get an accelerating effect of machines teaching machines. So what are the implications of driverless cars? And this is one of the things that's hardest to understand, because when people often look at driverless cars, they tend to think linearly. They tend to say, okay, I'm not in the car business, I'm not in the transportation business, so I don't care about driverless cars. Maybe my commute to work will be different. It'll be easier, but really, I don't care about it. But really what you have to understand is that driverless cars will have a ripple effect on the economy at the same scale as maybe the internet. Everything from end to end will be affected by driverless cars. But let me point out a couple of misconceptions about driverless cars that are important to understand. One of them is that somehow people are not ready for driverless cars, that people want to drive. And it's true that sometimes if you drive a convertible on an empty road across the Alps, it's fun. But generally speaking, most people are waiting for driverless cars suddenly to drive in their daily commute. So people are absolutely ready, in contrary to what some of the automotive companies might insist. There's also this misconception that somehow driverless cars need an infrastructure investment. And I was very careful to show you that actually that's the opposite. The old driverless cars needed infrastructure, but the new driverless cars are all inside the car. It's all software. There's actually zero infrastructure. In fact, less infrastructure is needed for driverless cars because they don't need road signs and they don't need a lot of other things. So they just need good roads and lane marks, much like humans. There's also this misconception, which I keep hearing, that the cars need to be 100% safe before people will trust them. And that's not true. And just a case in point, there have been already a couple of accidents of driverless cars, and the effect on sales from autopilot, let's say with Tesla, but the effect on sales of Tesla cars has been zero. People understand that there are statistics here. The same day that there's an accident with the driverless cars, there are 100 accidents with human-driven cars. In fact, the bar is low. There are today 23,000 people that die every week from human-driven cars. 23,000 globally every week. Next week, 23,000 people will die from human-driven cars, and we can save those people by having the driverless technology. In fact, this number, as we saw earlier today, is greater than most other ways in which people might die. It's greater than war and terrorism and drugs all combined. So imagine somebody came to you and said, I have a technology that can stop all war, terrorism, drugs, and violence tomorrow. Would you accept that? We have a technology that can do even more, save more lives than that. And this is just deaths. I'm not even talking about people who are injured. So I think that the next driverless car that you're going to buy, instead of just looking at its horsepower and miles per gallon, you'll also look at another number, which will tell you how safe it is compared to a human. This is the one number that people want to know. So now most people will not buy a car that's as safe as the average driver, because most people think they're better than average. But maybe if it's 2, 3, if it's 10 times safer than a human driver, you'd be crazy not to allow your children to drive in their driverless cars and insist on driving them alone. So I think we're going to see that trend, and this is the one number that legislators have to insist that we actually incorporate. There's a myth that there's some ethical dilemma that cars need to solve when deciding who to kill in an impending accident, and I think that's nonsense from a couple of reasons. One, accidents will almost never happen. But second is that, again, you have to remember that cars don't operate with rules and have dilemmas. Cars will calculate exactly the probability of injury of all possible trajectory and take the trajectory with the least injury possible, with the least risk possible. And I think it's actually a very simple and rational process. There's this myth that there are going to be fewer cars, but actually, while there will be fewer cars at any given moment, each car will drive more, will spend more of its time driving than parking. So overall, we will probably have more cars on the road than we do right now. In fact, all experts agree that we will have more miles per capita, more miles driven per capita than before. And that is, again, something that we have to think about. That's good news if you're a car manufacturer or a car mechanic. But the shape and size of these cars is going to be different. A lot of the cars moving around in cities today are for delivery. But when these cars are replaced with pods, like this pod made in Estonia, you can suddenly take a lot of, even though you have a lot of cars, the footprint of these cars is going to change and make things very different. This is a pod developed deployed by JD.com, the Amazon of China, that's already delivering things on sidewalks and call people on their phone when their delivery is ready. So we're seeing a lot of work on rethinking the shape and size of cars so that even though we have more cars, we might have less footprint. There's a myth that we're going to have a lot of unemployment because of driverless cars. And it's true that drivers will lose their jobs. Maybe body shop mechanics that fix car collisions and so on. But we'll also have a lot of new jobs. Not just AI and robotics jobs, but jobs in making cars, jobs in making roads, jobs in taking care of maintenance of cars and so on. So we're going to have a lot of new jobs around vehicles and road construction that are going to evolve. There's another myth that the cars are going to cost a lot, that these cars are expensive. And it's true that today driverless cars are very expensive because they're luxury items, they're a rarity. But in fact, a driverless car is a lot cheaper to make than a conventional car. You can eliminate a lot of the safety equipment, but also you can eliminate, let's say, the entire dashboard, which is a substantial cost of making the car. In fact, predictions are that driverless cars will cost about 1/3 of human-driven cars because of all these factors. And so it will make sense that actually people will own these cars and not only hop into pods. So again, when I talk to students, they usually think that nobody will own cars, but when I talk to people with kids, they immediately realize that you can't just hop into somebody else's car, into a taxi when you have kids. You have stuff in your car, you have car boosters, you have car seats, you have all kinds of things. And so I think as this technology develops, people will own more of their cars in addition to pods that might hop on and off on the street. So we're going to have a whole new ecosystem of designing cars, of what you can do in the car. Now that you don't have to drive the car, you can do other things, sleep, work, play, do all kinds of things. And again, there's going to be a ripple effect on the entire economy. In fact, I recently gave a talk at an alcohol beverage company and about driverless cars, and they are looking forward to driverless cars. They believe they know exactly what people are going to do in the car. So really, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you are going to be affected by driverless cars in one way or another. There's a lot of unintended consequences, a lot of things we don't know where they go. One of the big questions is this good for the environment? Certainly we'll have more miles driven per capita as cars drive themselves and drop off things, but the cars will be smaller and lighter, and maybe they'll be electric. So it's not clear if it's good or bad for the environment. What will cities look like when cars can move around and drop off people? Will we humans walk even less as cars can drop us off at a restaurant and pick us up and we don't even have to go to the restaurant? Or will we meet more people? Or will we meet less people? These are all questions that we don't know. How will advertising change? When you Google for Thai food at work, and next thing you know is that your car that's driving you home takes a route that brings you next to Thai restaurants. All these new different things where marketing touches the real world are going to happen. And one of the really unresolved issues, we heard a lot about this today, is the expression of censorship. So once you have a driverless car that takes you places, you're not in control so much of where you go, and it's pretty easy to make sure that you never go to certain parts of the city, or you never see certain things. There could be people who say, I don't want these cars to go through my neighborhood or that, and so forth. So there's going to be a whole new edge to censorship and content control that we don't even think about today, because we're living in a place where this only happens virtually but not physically. So again, we have this, we're at the cusp of an exciting times, and I think again, driverless cars, like any other type of robots, lived in this long period of disappointment, where we tried to build it for almost a century without success. We didn't have the technology to do that. We had pieces of it, but we didn't have the main thing, which is allowing cars to see. But now they can see, and we're at the cusp of a new era. Thank you.